This is gonna pick me up, right? Everyone can hear me? All right. Just want to start off by thanking everybody for allowing me to come to Yale University today and be able to deliver a speech on one of my favorite subjects, U.S. empire. I know that it was quite contentious, it seems, that there were a lot of people that didn't want me to come here today and speak to all of you. That's right. I know what that means now. I want to start off by thanking the Yale Union. I'm especially sad that Senator Rick Scott couldn't make it. I'm sure he had many opinions on whether or not we should end the U.S. empire and the global capitalist system, which is what I will be talking about today. And then your grandparents are probably going to hear about it on Fox News tomorrow. But it's an interesting resolution, end the U.S. empire. It's interesting because how do you end something that's already in the process of dying? Because that's the situation with the American empire as it stands today. The empire of the United States was born in the Spanish-American War and rose to the position of global superpower during World War II. People are hissing World War II. That's crazy. That was a good one that we fought. Sure, you can trace America's imperial roots to killing and stealing from the Native Americans or to the Mexican-American War, but America's status as a transoceanic power came with the dawn of the 20th century. After the Second World War, the American empire was in a time of expansion. We benefited greatly from our distance from the damage to the war itself. We hadn't suffered the terrible losses that our allies did, like in the USSR, with more than 20 million slain, defeating the Nazi scourge. But the Axis powers had been defeated. But the United States, fueled by anti-communist fervor, turned against its former ally, the Soviet Union. This next phase of the American empire was structured as a world competition between Washington and Moscow. Everywhere the United States looked, it found communists under the floorboards, under the beds, both real and imagined. And naturally, this anti-communist struggle went hand in hand with American imperial interest. From Europe to East Asia, the interests of our investors and our corporations were protected, and protected unconditionally, mind you. And rather than start converting our swords into plowshares at the end of World War II, we dropped atom bombs, 2 of them to be exact, to show the rest of the world that we had that capacity to change the tides of history in an irreparable manner. We helped out Nazi and Japanese war criminals. We got into a hot war in Korea where we used the information that we got from those pardoned Japanese war criminals, chemical and biological warfare on Korea. And we began this long-term worldwide Cold War. In other words, we became the monsters that we had supposedly vanquished. What Americans call the Cold War was, to most of the people on the planet, an endless series of butcheries, each more perverse and more tragic than the last. In Korea, the United States dropped 635,000 tons of bombs. By comparison, the United States dropped 500 tons of bombs in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. The United States and its allies destroyed Korea, cut the peninsula into 2, built up an anti-communist dictatorship in the southern half, and have maintained a 75-year economic war against the northern half. Global American aggression during this period, however, was not limited to the military. Sometimes we used covert operations to take out socialist governments, replacing them with our favorite clients. This was exceptionally effective in the Third World, where the American empire went into overdrive. Take the case of Chiquita. Some of you might be familiar with this company. Today, it's one of the world's biggest food companies. But once upon a time, it was called the United Fruit Company. And for a decade, the United Fruit Company worked as kind of a state within a state in Guatemala. All resources in the country, land, labor, transportation, you name it, were mobilized in service of United Fruit and its investors. Essentially, there was no part of the state left uncaptured by United Fruit. But a left-wing government came into power in Guatemala. After a 1944 revolution, and this socialist government pursued, trigger warning for all the capitalists in here, land reform. To make matters worse, they tried to break U.S. corporate control over their land and to reappropriate it to Guatemala's vast peasantry. To make it even scarier, they also reformed the labor code, giving the power to strike to the workers on United Fruit's plantations. But Uncle Sam had different plans. That was far too much. I should point out that the American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, you might be aware of this person, had previously been United Fruit's corporate lawyer. Now, he was in a position to back them up. In 1954, the CIA organized a coup d'etat in Guatemala. They did this by isolating Guatemala diplomatically, punishing it economically, cutting off weapons purchases, and when Guatemala was weakened, the CIA organized an army in exile to finish the job and to throw out the socialist government. The CIA drew up a list of dozens of communists to be killed by assassination. Guatemala has suffered in poverty and violence for most of its history since then. Now, many people have rightfully wondered, what was the point of defeating the Nazis if we went on to dominate so much of the globe as violently as we have? Was the point of all of it so that we could have the rest of the world to ourselves? The Guatemalan president, Juan José Arevalo, delivered a speech at the height of the American pressure campaign that kind of channels that exact same question. Before the coup d'etat, he said these words, and I think those words still ring true today. He said, and I quote, "The war that began in 1939 ended, but in the ideological dialogue between the two worlds and two leaders, Roosevelt lost the war. The real victor was Adolf Hitler. It is my personal opinion that the contemporary world is moved by the ideas that served as the foundation on which Hitler rose to power." 70 years later, I think history has proven Arevalo right. In place after place, time after time, the United States can never settle down its imperial bloodlust, this forever hunt for manifest destiny. We can draw a straight line from indigenous massacres of the early United States to the 20th century, killing fields that we have created in the Third World. Hi. In Vietnam, we continued France's colonial war for decades, tearing society apart at home for pretty much no strategic gain abroad. In Iran, we spent the 1970s sending the brutal Shah's regime billions of dollars of weapons, only for those same weapons to fall into the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Government in '79, our new and heavily armed worst enemies. Worse enemies that kept propping up over and over again. Enemies that we designed sometimes because they simply wanted to have dignity and sovereignty. The story keeps repeating itself over and over again. We didn't do much better with Iraq, where we spent the 1980s arming Saddam before invading and then sanctioning Iraq into destitution. We wielded Iraq as a weapon against Iran as well at that point. All that before we actually invaded and just straight up broke the country in 2003. I can go on and on and on. And we celebrated the fall of the Soviet Union, cheering on its destruction, which plummeted millions and millions of people into an economic disaster, the consequences of which we still see today. At Zohran Mamdani's election victory night party, I was interviewed by a media outlet where I said, we defeated the USSR and the USSR dissolved, unfortunately. This was quite the controversial statement at the time. Fox News still loves repeating this soundbite. And some Democrats also channel that frustration as well. They say, how dare you, Hasan? The USSR was our enemy. They were ruthless, authoritarian. The fall of the USSR was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. Just wait, listen, maybe you'll agree. Not only was there incalculable harm done to every single country under its banner, child prostitution, skyrocketing suicide rates, life expectancy plummeting, but America was no longer contested around the globe. And it is precisely because of the end to that multipolarity that we saw accelerated neoliberalism that is devastating every Western nation right now. Unlimited and unchecked greed. Our successes are leading to our own demise and the demise and collapse of the liberal system. The U.S. has produced disaster after disaster after disaster. I am reminded, however, of some famous words spoken by a guy by the name of Mao Zedong. Speaking with an American journalist in 1946, Mao Zedong said these words: all reactionaries are paper tigers. In appearance, the reactionaries are terrifying. But in reality, they are not so powerful. Speaking of U.S. imperialism, people seem to feel that it is terrifically strong. But it will be proved that the U.S. reactionaries, like all reactionaries in history, do not have much strength. In the United States, there are others who are really strong. The American people. I think about that quote quite a bit, especially in these last couple of weeks as Operation Epstein's Fury wages on. Perhaps Mao was right about this, but maybe he was a little too early. After all, being a leftist is about being right, but too early. I'll revisit that quote in a little bit. I want to talk about another great man, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. You might know him as Lenin. Lenin. It was Lenin who described imperialism as the highest or newest stage of capitalism. Successful imperialist powers, he observed, allowed their citizens to benefit from the exploitation of their colonies. But the system was unstable. The development of imperial economies was uneven. The colonies were a way of sending surplus capital and people into new markets. In the 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah, the African socialist who served as Ghana's first president, updated Lenin's theory with his own book on neocolonialism. What he described was how, in the era of decolonization under American hegemony, colonialism actually endured. Through many different ways, foreigners were still able to dominate notionally independent countries like the Congo or Colombia. To give an example, say an African country nationalizes its oil reserves, but unfortunately, they don't own or operate their own domestic refineries. Or maybe they don't even have domestic refineries at all. Say that African nation decides to take a closer look at the Western capital-backed contracts. What do you think happens? All of a sudden, armed militancy and uprisings prop up, left and right. Instability is born out of nowhere. Now, those militants might not wear a NASCAR jacket that says Shell Corporation, but that doesn't change the reality that those militancies oftentimes are working for the same exact interests. So there's the visible forms of intervention, rendered invisible through the covert actions of the State Department, but then there's the more complex forms of economic imperialism through a financial infrastructure that Western capital has built to benefit its own interests, offering loans through the IMF only to cycle that wealth back to foreign capital. It's one of many ways. Loans that come with tremendous restrictions like austerity. Money that is handed over to developing nations that are only allowed to be spent in ways that generate returns for foreign investors. And to think all of that debt in the third world that is owed to financial institutions in wealthy countries, whether it's Goldman Sachs or the IMF, capital does not go to those who most need it. This has been, with, of course, substantial updates, the system of global exploitation that has endured for decades. And it has been facilitated by the United States, which, after so many disasters, is now running out of energy to hold this system together. There are no more big enemies left that the United States can beat. And after an empire destroys all of its enemies, it turns the gun on itself. After all of this plunder is not necessarily done for you. It's done for parasitic international capital. And parasitic capital has no loyalty to ethnicities, religions, nationalities, but only to the almighty dollar, only to the profit motive. Although critics have been pointing out the decline of American imperial power for decades, I'm certainly one of those critics, we've never seen the decline happen so quickly. And we have never had this much obvious evidence for it. The many Trumps around the world, like Viktor Orban, they're not doing so hot. They're not doing great. As the Ukraine war heads to a settlement that will be unfavorable to NATO, the United States and Europe are fighting over Greenland and Benjamin Netanyahu. And speaking of Benjamin Netanyahu, some might say the real president, a man with great ambition, constantly trying to get America to become more active in waging war with Iran for multiple decades. Well, he found the perfect guy to do it with. Donald Trump let the Israelis drag the U.S. into this newest war with Iran after 3 years of bipartisan support for the genocide that Israel was committing on a different front of Israel's multiple ongoing wars of aggression. While Americans have shown the world that might makes right, it appears the U.S. has bit off more than it can chew with this supposedly 47-year imminent threat, which is just really picking on a country that chose to fight back for the first time in a very long time. And one of the lessons that not only we are learning, but the rest of our security partners are learning, is that in the absence of soft power, 800 military bases that we have all around the world can very quickly turn into 800 separate invasions, or in the case of the Gulf nations, it can turn into missile sponges at the behest of Israel, almost overnight. And all of this is happening as the United States government has destroyed its credibility domestically with a murderous and absurd deployment of ICE as the cost of living just keeps going up and up and up. The very same tactics that we have observed in countries that we have dominated, in countries that our allies have dominated, like in occupied Palestine, are now being turned back on the domestic home front against American citizens. Masked thugs of the state, unaccountable to no one, unelected, are engaging in acts of violence against Americans with impunity. And when Americans fight back against ICE, as they did in Minneapolis, ICE shoots back. And the problems continue. The analyst Stephen Semler wrote recently that Trump's budget manages to be $361 billion larger than last year's, despite cutting $300 billion in social programs and other public investments. All of that money is going to policing, and it's going to endless war. It's not going to bridges, it's not going to tunnels, and it's certainly not going to health care. Every single one of you, regardless of your political affiliations or your ideology, should consider that money to be stolen from you. Those are dollars stolen from you to be put towards industries of death that have no future. This bargain isn't tenable anymore. It's over. It's not tenable for the employee of the California missile designer. It's not tenable for the veteran who wants free college. It's not tenable for the kids in crumbling Philadelphia schools. And it's certainly not tenable for the homeless, the working class, and of course, for the rest of the world. Those who happen to exist under the boot. We have been spoiled by an American way of life that requires so much death. The fruits of imperialism were always immoral. Now, they are obviously rotten. I don't know how else to put it. The American empire is fading fast, regardless of what we resolve here today. And I'm not just saying that so that I have an upper hand in this conversation. No matter what we say here, American empire is going to inevitably fall. But I think, as Mao Zedong himself said earlier, there is a power within the American people to change the nature of this decline. He had a lot more confidence in the American labor class than many Americans do today, I'll tell you that much. I believe that we are living through a strange and radicalizing time for millions of Americans, and I've seen that with my own two eyes. I've gone to protests all around the world, tasted the tear gas of different countries, and I've seen Barbaras and Deborahs, aged 75 and above, yelling at ICE agents in Minneapolis. The contradictions have worsened, and they are also restless. They also want that change. People intuitively understand that there is another way for the United States to exist in the world. A way in which we're not constantly exploiting people, deciding other countries' futures for them, or, say, blockading their seas because they just completely embarrassed us politically, like in the case of Cuba. Holding on to old grudges for no reason as we starve, economically and literally, an island nation that happens to be 90 miles off of our coastline where 10 million people live. And that's happening on autopilot. It's happening even if you give no consent to that whatsoever. But we can change that. Once you see the cruelty of American empire, it's quite difficult to unsee it. And I do think American people are seeing it for the first time ever. And they know that we are getting a raw deal. The super profits that we have enjoyed are coming to an end. And our debt to humanity requires negotiating a new deal, a real, equal world peace. Empires never die quietly, and we must end the American empire regardless. But we must manage the retreat of a superpower from the world stage. This is a challenge for our time. Actually, this is the challenge for our time. Because if we do not do this, then the American empire will come to an end in a much more violent way. A curse on future generations that we must avoid at all costs. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Questions on speech? Perhaps questions? Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Well, I thank Mr. Piker for his speech. I agree with all his points. I think that when Mr. Piker mentions that the American people are the political body from which struggle begins, I guess I want to ask Mr. Piker, how do we also square American national struggle with international struggle? What does it look like to actually have this sort of overthrow the empire and be something that isn't a kind of national problem?
Great question. So, from my calculation, the way I see it, as I tried to explain in this speech here, is that it's going to happen because it will collapse on its weight no matter what. It'll collapse under its weight regardless. And what I want to explain to every American that will listen is that we do have the capacity to change the system that we exist under in an effort to ensure that we have a much more equitable outcome where we don't diminish the potential of Americans and we don't diminish the potential and starve out the potential of people living in the periphery. This is something that I saw personally when I visited Cuba recently. The economic terror that we've subjected this island nation to is unforgivable. And yet the Cuban population has still thrived in very meaningful ways. They found novel cures for the lung cancer vaccine that they've had since the 90s. And I was talking to a scientist on my trip there, and apparently Cuba also has the only current working treatment for Alzheimer's and dementia. It's in stage 3 clinical trials in Canada right now as we speak. I think about what Cuba would look like if they weren't constantly under the threat of American sanctions. Because these sanctions have stifled growth. They've played a formative role in developing even further cures, right? So that's not just bad for the people of Cuba who are suffering. Their economy is in tatters. But it's also bad for people like ourselves. I mean, Alzheimer's and dementia is a massive problem. Almost all of my grandparents suffered from Alzheimer's and dementia. So the way I see it, it's almost a selfish argument to make sure that we can unlock the potential of all of these countries that we seek to dominate. And on top of that, I feel like all of the resources, all of our productive output is wasted on this unlimited, endless cycle of violence that we subject other nations to. And as soon as you connect foreign policy back to all of the domestic problems that we have, not just in the concept of blowback, which I famously have spoken about, but also the reality that every dollar that is spent on a bomb is spent on a bomb that blows up a school is a dollar that could be spent building schools here. Americans, at least in my experience, are much more responsive to that kind of message. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to use academic language or talk about the international proletarian cause. You can just tell regular folks, ordinary folks, that random person living in Tehran has the exact same interest that you and I do. They want to have shelter. They want to have a hot meal. They want a better future for their children. We're all people. So, at least in my experience, that's been a way to get ordinary Americans who've never really thought about these sorts of things to start thinking about it in these terms that dictate that we cease our senseless violence and bloodshed campaigns overseas and instead focus on ourselves. There was a guy who said that, and he won twice. His name is Donald Trump. He lied, but that's what he said. And it was successful. I hope that we can have more earnest leaders who will actually advance that cause so that we can allow the nations of the periphery to breathe, so that they can develop sovereignty and dignity for themselves, so they can unlock their potential, and that we can unlock the potential of Americans as well.
Further questions? Perhaps a question. Sure.
I'm very glad that the guest spoke about equity. I'm very glad that he spoke about morality. I am slightly less glad that he spoke disapprovingly about the U.S. intervention in South Korea. If he truly disapproves of the U.S. intervention in South Korea, what exactly about a unified communist Korea, for instance, would he find to be equitable? What about it would he find to be good, more preferable than the current capitalism?
Great question. From my assessment, I don't necessarily care about the way that other countries govern themselves. I know that we like to act as though we do. It's the basis for American intervention. It's the number one argument that we present as to why we must intervene in other countries' affairs. But it's an inherently hypocritical argument because there are plenty of countries in the world that have devastating systems, ruthless autocracies that are formative allies of the United States, and no such intervention is ever seen as a necessity. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, the kafala system that they have. Now, you might say this is whataboutism, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, for my estimation, the things that we did in Korea before there was such a thing as South Korea or North Korea were unbearable. Not only did we prop up a military dictatorship that was unbelievably authoritarian and unbelievably deadly, taking out any kind of socialist, trade unionist, or communist uprisings that were taking place in the South. But beyond that, what we did in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, is tantamount to genocide. The only distinction is that it was America that did the genocide, so the rest of the world does not call it a genocide. What can you call the destruction of 90% of all standing buildings? What do you call the death and destruction, the utilization of biological and chemical weapons on the Korean population that led I believe, 10% drop-off of the entire population? It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable bloodshed. I don't know what Korea would look like in the absence of our intervention, but I can only speak to what we've done to Korea. And what we've done to Korea is incredibly violent, and for no good reason whatsoever.
Further questions? Yes. Perhaps ask an ultimate question.
They want to ask more. They're hissing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm truthfully with about 90% of Mr. Hasan's argument. I do, however, have a question regarding when the U.S. should use its power abroad. Countries will do this as a function of sovereignty and having to maintain allies, relationships, etc. When is it right for the U.S. to intervene in, say, Ukraine or Taiwan? Should the U.S. have gotten involved in something like World War II, even though it's not our country?
It's a great question as well. I think exhausting diplomatic solutions is the most important thing that the United States should be doing in every single scenario. And once it's established that diplomacy is impossible, then I think military intervention can be reasonable. An example I'll use is not Taiwan or Ukraine, but Israel. This is why I advocate for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions from the state of Israel. 80 years of apartheid. 80 years of settler colonial violence, ethnic cleansing, mass surveillance, mass incarceration of Palestinians, robbed from their ancestral homelands with no right to return. Against all international humanitarian law, against every rule in the rule book. Israel has been able to do this because they were an invaluable Cold War ally and an invaluable ally to the United States' interests in this resource-rich region. But if there was such a scenario, where in the aftermath of that one phone call that Joe Biden could have made, that Donald Trump could make, that he seemingly chooses not to, be really good if he made that phone call, especially lately. What comes next would be social pariah status at the international stage. No more political cover for Israel. No more weapons to Israel. No more aid to Israel. And if that doesn't work, sanctions on Israel. Now, I'm of the mindset that it wouldn't even get to that. That's why I believe that a single phone call would probably put an end to this kind of death and destruction. But as far as our foreign adversaries goes, I think we present a lot of opportunities. We create a lot of instability around the world with our intervention, with our interventions in the affairs of other countries in an effort to constantly prod at these foreign adversaries that we've designed, rather than trying to have an equitable solution that treats these countries not as foreign adversaries, but as diplomatic partners. But in the absence of that, of course, I think military intervention would be appropriate.
For an actually ultimate question.
Wait, I can't hear you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I agree with him on many points, but I'm curious about his last point on the dangers of ending the American empire. What exactly does the process of ending the American empire with, as you said, preventing catastrophe for future generations look like? And is it not the case that if the American empire ends, that another global imperial power will rise?
Great question. So this is the argument that necessitates the existence of American empire, right? This is what we tell ourselves. This is what we are taught to fear. The idea that if we were to retreat from the rest of the world, other great powers would be just as ruthless to us. But the way that I think about it, as someone who's fascinated by movements of liberation throughout time, this argument has been the exact same argument time and time again. The idea that the white slaver, if they were to abolish slavery, would live in the same status in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery and be treated by the newly freed African men and women in the same way that the slaver treated them. The idea that if liberation came to countries like Algeria, or if the apartheid in South Africa was abolished, that somehow this new formation would actually punish the 10% whites in apartheid South Africa in the same way that the 10% white population has punished the black population. History has also shown us that that's not what happens. It's never happened. So the idea that other countries would treat the United States of America with the same violence that we have subjected them to has never really borne itself out. So I don't believe that that would be the case. It's a fear that many people hold on to, though, and I think that fear is what justifies, in the eyes of many Americans, the continuation of empire. Now, you asked me about trying to manage this retreat and what this catastrophic outcome would look like. I think we're living through that right now. The destruction of all previous rules of engagement, international human rights, the law of the jungle, a retreat from our previous security commitments, no longer relying on soft power initiatives. This is the death of American empire. We've now moved on to a much more vulgar form of imperialism, much more vulgar form of commanding our interests over the rest of the globe. And I think, and I hope that this is not the case, but I think that things are going to get even more violent from this point on. So that's what I'm trying to avoid. Because the reality of the matter is empires rarely die quietly. They go out over the course of sometimes centuries, but in America's case, probably a lot shorter, with increasing amounts of violence. And we're seeing that with our little sister nation, Israel, right now, going through its own fascist death spiral, not dissimilar to what the Nazis went through. I want to avoid that.
And for perhaps briefest final question, I have a question. So the guest sort of makes this claim that the American empire is already ended, right? We don't, there's not much to do. It's in this death spiral, right? As someone who sort of wants to see this empire end, like the guest, should he just do nothing and wait for it to end? If he wants the empire to end and it is ending, what's the point of doing anything politically if one can just sort of wait around and wait for it to end?
Great question. My statements are more so a warning for people. And like I mentioned, I want to manage this decline, and I want to move into the next phase of American development before it gets so totally out of hand that we see something as devastating, God forbid, as a nuclear holocaust or something. Because if the current economic organization of the American society persists, then the income inequality that we're facing is only going to worsen as wealth just stays at the top of society, and people who are from a working class background have a horrible end of that bargain, and their material conditions deteriorate even further, also accelerated by climate change too. So what I want to do is try to organize against that and to ensure that we have the most peaceful transition possible, so that we don't, so that we stop starving the potential of the masses here in the United States of America as well as elsewhere around the world.
And with that, yes, thanks.